Hi, my name is Allison Hennessy, and this is my final project on the abolition of the Juvenile Detention Center. So this is my prompt that I was given, and my prompt is, in what ways has the Juvenile Detention Center in the United States changed since its inception? What hasn't changed? Has juvenile justice reform fixed the earlier problems of the juvenile detention centers? Why or why not? So this is my first slide. I thought I would start out with a little bit of history on the juvenile detention centers. So juvenile detention centers have been around since the late 18th and early 19th century, charging juvenile delinquencies to time in jail due to their criminal behavior. During the start of these juvenile centers, there really weren't many rules or regulations on how to act. Courts would just kind of punish and confine children, often treating them like they were adult criminals. During this time as well, the early juvenile system relied heavily on the social ideas of reform, and such as rehabilitating those children and adolescents back into society. The court system followed the concept of parens patriae, which kind of means where the court assumes responsibility, treatment, and rehabilitation of that juvenile child, and the theory that highly influenced how the public viewed the criminal behavior and the different social status between poor, middle class, and wealthy class. And while parents was designed to handle youth committing criminal acts, the discussion of this philosophy became kind of increasingly more broad, and it was constantly debated in court kind of whether or not we should charge these youths into the adult system. So this next slide is kind of showing the harsh reality during these times. Until the early 19th century in the United States, children as young as 7 years old were being trialed into a criminal court and being convicted and sentenced to prison or even death. And many early issues arise during this time in the detention centers because there was really no rehabilitation. There was a lot of overcrowdedness. Children were being trialed as adults, and these punishments for these children were very harsh. Children were being sentenced kind of simply based off the mood, temperament, or personal philosophy of the judge at that time, which created a debate between social welfare and social control, and that kind of focuses on the best interests of the individual child, versus focusing on the punishment of that child. So for example, social welfare can be defined as a group or assistance of programs that's designed to ensure the well-being of a nation's citizen. And social control can be defined as the way that kind of the norms of society, the rules, the laws, structure, regulate that human behavior. So it kind of, it created a focus between whether or not they wanted to charge these people focusing on their social welfare, focusing on their social control. And I think it was also a way for them to want to decrease the crime rates during this time. So for example, in this slide, you can kind of see how the early crime rates of 1980 to 2004 were. And as you can see here as well, there was a huge increase in the crime rates during the late 1900s, which kind of created a rise in reformers' interest in wanting to change the juvenile system. So this was kind of just what happened during the rise in crime rates. A steep rise occurred between the late 1900s, and in response to that, juvenile crime, it would continue to rise, and legislators kind of designed to get tough on crime, and it started the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act, which was amended to kind of include provisions that would allow states to trial juveniles as adults for some violent crimes and not really every single crime. So it kind of was the start of people under 18 being trialed as children versus adults. And the Juvenile Delinquency Prevention Act granted states to follow a series of protections on a care and treatment of youth in the juvenile system. And it kind of focused on the missing parts that the juvenile system wasn't really focusing on, which was like, rehabilitation, all of that type of stuff. And with their punishments during this time being so brutal on the kids, they weren't really experiencing a way of being better in society, and it kind of upped the crime rates, and it kind of upped the philosophers wanting to reform the system and focusing on the rehabilitation of these children, and also creating laws that stated kids can't be or cannot be child under 18 due to the severity of their crime. And I think this kind of started, the steps to reform. And in response to these increasing crime rates, reformers Thomas Eddy and John Gripson kind of organized and opposed housing youth in adult jails and urged the creation of a new type of institution that focused on rehabilitating youth and not putting them with children. And I think these reformers believed that treating children and adolescents as adult criminals was unnecessarily harsh, and it kind of resulted in their corruption and upped their criminal rates. And as well, during this time, Thomas and John established what was called the New York House of Refuge. And these houses of refuges were large fortresses, kind of concrete style, which were located in urban institutions, which kind of focused on the delinquent, abandoned youth and how they can better them in society. And the average number of these youths during this time in refuge was 200, and it kind of became overcrowded at times, and they were quickly confronting a lot of the same issues that happened in adult jails. So overcrowding, deteriorating conditions, staff abuse, etc. And in addition, with the emerging public and education of the society, social reformers began arguing for a new type of institution that kind of based an emphasis on education and rehabilitation. So I think that kind of started their reform on wanting to add more institutions and create more ways that children can better themselves in society. And this kind of had a response to them overcrowding and becoming this way, kind of responded to an increase in the crime. And I think that it kind of created a concern for public safety that a lot of reformers kind of stepped into. And then it also kind of went into this era called the Progressive Era. And all this kind of started because of a dramatic increase in social conditions and immigration. And this kind of resulted in hundreds of children wandering the streets and many becoming involved in criminal activity, which shown earlier in the other slides, that graph, the crime rates did succeed during this time, and children offenders over the age of 7 were still being imprisoned with adults. And they became kind of bad to society. And I think some actions of social reformers happened during this time, and they began a shift in society's view on juvenile delinquents. And early reformers who were kind of interested in doing this rehabilitation rather than punishing the children were now building more of these refuge houses and taking note on the fact that the youth incarceration problem is something that they needed to touch on. So they had the responsibility to recover the lives of these youth offenders before they committed these more criminal activities, and youths were no longer being trialed as adults because their cases were heard in court, often, evaluating evidence outside of legal facts and using whatever behavior and home life that they came from and taking into consideration of that. And also, early reform houses were in many ways similar to orphanages because they were housing a lot of homeless and a lot of children that have come from families and come from backgrounds that force them into committing these crimes. And lawmakers and other officials soon realized that these children that were institutionalized with the adults and with having backgrounds of life that weren't the best, they kind of were learning this adult criminal behavior and were executing those life careers in criminal behavior and kind of committing those crimes as worse as the adults were. So this kind of started the thing on, like, even today, some minors can be trialed as adults, depending on the severity of their crime. It was like the idea behind teaching skills of criminology and teaching the result of their social environment and survival mechanism and what they did, the way that they did it, and just society's response with that. And as well, some 3 types of juvenile institutions that began during this time were houses of refuge, new reformities, and then they also created some separate institutions for juvenile females that created a sense of putting them in an environment that they were more comfortable with. And because of this progressive era and because of these reformers taking part, due to these new institutions being built and rehabilitation, there were more juveniles having chances of becoming better in society, and legal reforms and policy changes were taken in place, making it easier for juveniles who had committed certain offenses as an adult to be, have more decision making and have more options in that aspect and offering the rehabilitation for those juveniles. But changes in this law did not necessarily translate into changes in practice. So in addition, when kind of talking about in addition to belief that these individuals were kind of treated and rehabilitated, some of this didn't really change in their practice, and they still resulted in overcrowding and sentencing individuals that they needed to more harshly. And these factors still played a role in those decision-making processes, because they weren't just going to say, oh, you're under 18, so we're just going to trial you as this, but you committed 4 murders, so it kind of makes sense to trial them as an adult. So yeah, this kind of started some changes, and it kind of helped ways that there was more rehabilitation and more ways that children were going to be given the opportunity to not be going straight to adult court. But like I said before, this didn't really necessarily translate to a lot of changes in the practice. Children were still being sentenced to wrong convictions. And I think also a big part of the issue in the juvenile delinquency system that I didn't really touch on is race. And I think that it continues to be something that people need to touch on, and people need, it's very relevant in our society right now. And I think it's something that, they need to still work on and still kind of have that. And ever since they've, built these institutions, the overcrowding issues have become a lot better, because there's been a lot more institutions. However, they still are kind of, to me at least, they don't really understand the difference of like a mentally unstable child versus a child who just comes from a life and just kind of wants to commit these crimes and doesn't really have a mental disability that is swaying their decisions on committing these crimes. And I think that it's still something that is a problem that occurs in the juvenile system today. And it's still, I think, the debate between social welfare and social control, and kind of believing that whatever's relevant today in the system continues to be something that should be taught to others. And I think, overall rehabilitation for these children is something that still is something, that needs to be touched on today and everything. But overall, thanks for watching my PowerPoint, and I hope you all enjoyed my project. Thank you.